Okay, well, things are, looks like we're getting, looks like we got our folks here and we're gonna have a session. And just some clarification, there was a question in the chat before we get all kicked off, because the deadline is actually tomorrow. If you're wanting to submit anything to the Iowa Poetry Association for their any of their contest categories, including the first ever Grant Wood Poetry Prize. And the judge for that, for the Grant Wood Prize, is Tim Fay, longtime founder, editor of the Wapsipinicon Almanac, there in East Central Iowa. So, and you can read about him on the IPA website if you would like to. So I just wanted to clarify that. So yeah, nobody who's closely involved with this forum is judging, and that's by design. So, without, and by the way, I hope most of you got the email that I sent out next week. I just want to get folks excited about popping back in next week, and I'm wanting to do a bit of a recap of the sessions we did, kind of go back to some of our notes, remind ourselves of everything we did, where you can find any information that's dangling out there that you might be interested in, and of course do some readings. And so there's the last two recordings, they are having some technical difficulties, so we're asking for some patience. The most recent one that's on their website is the 6th, February 6th. So the other two, they're working on it. Something happened with the recordings. They're having to tap their IT people. So I know the recordings are long and that sort of thing too. So they're doing the best they can, and they'll get them up there when they're able to. And for this evening session, Dawn will be here after we've had the presentation with Q&A and some conversation to end our session today with. She's going to discuss some sonnets, I believe, is the topic this time. So be glad to hear about that. So without further ado, let me see. I would love it if Paul and Dorothy, like we've done with our other presenters, if you would, if you would kindly talk about kind of how you came to Grant Wood, the forum. Both are, what I'd like to do is I'd like to toot both their horns just a little bit. I don't have the bios because I would ask that you do a little of that for us, like we do with the other presenters. But Dorothy, I do know she is bringing, she's all up and running here, and partially I would say that's because she is a professional speaker. So that is something that she does. And so we're so happy that she's able to share that expertise with us, as well as her expertise in the research and the love of all things Grant Wood and that. And Paul is all over the page with, letting someone in here. Just love Paul's background as a go-to researcher and resource and collector and presenter and author of many books related to Iowa and Grant Wood, historian, go-to historian. And you can see an interview with him on our Facebook page too, or the YouTube channel, Grant Wood Presents. So I wanted to give a shout out there. And so I'm going to stop talking now. And if you both wouldn't mind talking about yourself just a little bit before you start, that would be wonderful.
I'm going to let Paul start.
Well, I can tell you a little bit about how I got involved with Grant Wood. I'm a collector of stereographs, and I had a lot of stereographs from the 1870s and 1880s of Clear Lake, Iowa. So I decided to do a spiral bound book on Clear Lake, which I did. And during the time I was in Clear Lake, I became friends with several people that had known Grant Wood and Park Reinert in the summer of 1941, the last summer of Grant's life that he spent in Clear Lake. One of them was named John Perkins, and John and Park had actually graduated from high school together in Clear Lake. And I sensed right away, because I had read a few biographies of Grant Wood, and they would often simply say he spent the last summer in summer of 1941 in Clear Lake. And I thought, well, there's more to this story, and if I don't act on it right away, I think the story will be lost. So I put together a small book, a spiral-bound book called Grant Wood's Clear Lake Summer. And that's kind of how I got involved with Clear Lake. I enjoyed his story and have continued researching it. How about you, Dorothy?
Well, I'm so glad you went first because I grew up in the Linn County, Jones County area. So originally from Iowa. Tonight, though, I'm broadcasting from northwest of Los Angeles. I'm in Ventura County. But when I started to research my book, I went to a book signing at the Anamosa Library when I was home. And there was this gentleman by the name of Paul C. Jewell that was signing his book, Grant Wood's Clear Lake Summer. And he was so inspiring. And I wanted to also go behind you, Paul, because you are so humble. But we look at Paul as the leading expert around Grant Wood. I mean, the authentic Iowa perspective, the eyes on the Iowan who Grant Wood was. So very happy to be with Paul tonight to do this. But yeah, never thought in 2010 would I ever be doing something like this with him tonight. But my pleasure.
Debbie, did you get snow, by the way?
We do. We have a lot of snow on the mountains out here in the LA area, believe it or not.
Yeah, I saw it on the news.
Yeah. Yeah. We need the moisture, so we're happy.
Well, we could probably begin our talk. Dorothy and I are both excited to tell you more about Grant's painting called The Appraisal. And I think as I thought about it this afternoon, I thought, this is a kind of painting that really calls for people to speculate on what the women are saying and put it in words, in poetry or short story, because it almost looks like they could turn their heads and talk to us, I think. There's many things to notice in this painting, and I'll point out a few of them and then elaborate on it. The painting was done in 1931, and there's really three models, three characters in the painting. There's also two red barns, one's much larger than the other. There's a white porch with a green door. There's clothing and accessories, certainly on both of the women in the painting. And you'll also see a rather patterned lawn between the house and the two women. Well, let me talk a little bit about these three characters. And the one, of course, is an animal. It's a chicken. And if you've followed Grant Wood, you know that Grant had an affinity for chickens, and he used them in many of his paintings. Maybe they were just in the background. I think of, I know in The Birthplace of Herbert Hoover, there's a few chickens in the background amongst the buildings. And it could have come clear from his preschool days. He said even then he drew some pictures of chickens, and he fed the chickens there on the farm between his 10 years of life there. He collected their eggs, and he seemed to like the chickens. Well, this particular chicken even had a name, according to Grant's sister Nan, and it was named by Grant, and he called it Good Old Boy. And it was a big bird that had been purchased by Grant. And during the time of his one and only modeling session, a Good Old Boy was housed in the base of a Chinese wicker hourglass chair that they had at 5 Turner Alley. And every night, Grant would run a broom handle through the wicker to serve as a roost for the bird. And Grant, over those days and weeks, grew very fond of this rooster. And once Nan said that she thought that Good Old Boy might be a little lonesome. So she got a mirror, a large full-length mirror, and let Good Old Boy see his mirror image. Well, when Good Old Boy saw it, he got red in the wattles, he fluffed his feathers, and he wanted to fight the image. Well, during the same time period, he also began to crow, and Nan felt it would never stop. And he was housed about 10 feet from Nan's head in her bed. Grant once said that it was enough to wake the dead in Turner Mortuary next door. And Hattie hoped that the family wouldn't be arrested for keeping a rooster in their city home. And the crowing it usually occurred about 4:00 a.m. every day. And it almost became a bit of an alarm clock for the people. When the appraisal was finished, Nan said that Grant gave Good Old Boy to a Mr. Bailey, who was the truant officer. And that's character one. Any questions on Good Old Boy? Or any comments?
And we do want to keep this very interactive tonight, so feel free to jump in, ask your questions.
Yeah, we like interaction. So if you have any comments or questions, hit me with it.
Paul, was Good Old Boy the chicken that ate the rubber cigarette?
Well, that was a story that Nan refuted. The story came, I think, maybe in one of the books, but the story was that Grant would smoke cigarettes and Good Old Boy would pick them up and eat them. And then somebody put a rubber worm on the ground. The chicken picked it up and choked on it and died. But Nan later said that there was no truth to that at all. So again, in research, you get varying stories, but that's the one that I go with, is the one I just told you about.
And we do have a question in the chat, just to be doubly sure, make sure we know what kind of chicken that is.
I did know at one time, I think it's a Plymouth Rock.
Yes,
Could that be?
Yes.
If I don't know my chickens.
it is a Plymouth Rock, yes.
Well, if not any questions, we can always come back to Good Old Boy, but I'll talk about the farm woman then, the model. And that was a woman named Elizabeth, but she always went by the name Betty Rupke. And she was a teacher in the Cedar Rapids schools. And she was selected, some have said, because she had a really strong resemblance to a man named Ed Rowan. And Mr. Rowan at that time was the administrator of what they called the Little Gallery in the town. And that little gallery was on First Avenue. And it was located in a home that had been given to the arts by the Palmer family. And Austin Palmer, many of you know, was the originator of the Palmer method of penmanship, in which you made large circles and lines in terms of learning how to write. It was located not far from 5 Turner Alley, but it was on First Avenue. Right later on, the Palmers built an apartment house and it was right next to that. It's no longer there, but it was a spot where artists would gather. And at one point in his friendship with Ed Rowan, Grant had a feeling that local artists weren't getting enough room for exhibitions, and that he really felt strongly that Ed should be showing more local artists' work. And it kind of, he talked to Ed about it, but Ed kind of put him off, and it angered Grant a little bit. And he began to complain to 2 women friends of his. One was Harriet Brown and the other was Mary Lackerstein. Later on, he would ask Mary to be the third model in this painting that he had just finished. One day, Grant said to the women that he just had to get this out of his system. And he told them he had an idea for a painting. And he, in that initial conversation, according to Hazel Brown, he described it as a farm woman in ragged sweater with a Plymouth Rock hen under her arm, stooping, or rather cringing as she appraises the tall, haughty woman in whose hands a purse drips money. But in the meantime, Ed and Grant had become friends again and talked it over, seemed to have a good understanding. So Grant really changed his ideas about the painting, and now it shows a tall, erect, good-looking farm woman who looks like Ed Rowan and who is eyeing the purse in the hands of the haughty woman. Betty was born in Waterloo in 1905, and she attended both Iowa State Teachers College, and then later on in her life, you can see that resemblance, can't you? This is a portrait of Betty. Later on in her life, she got a BA from the University of Omaha in 1945. And I gotta turn my pages here.
And Paul, I have to tease, those bangs are coming back in style.
Are they? Well, I like this picture of Betty. And you can sure see what a talented portrait artist Grant was, because the picture in appraisal really looks like her, doesn't it? Well, Grant actually used several photographs of Betty Rupke dressed as a farm wife and holding a chicken as he painted appraisal. A few years after posing, Betty married a guy whose name was Claire Ruskin, Sanborn, always known by Sandy. And in 1937, the couple moved to Omaha. Mr. Sanborn here was a composer and piano teacher, and Betty had taught both art and penmanship while she was in Cedar Rapids. But when she was in Nebraska, she really began a career as an artist, and Sandy here became well-known in musical circus circles. For the most part, Betty was a traveling teacher, and then she became head of the art department at Technical High School in Omaha. And prior to coming to Cedar Rapids, Betty had been a teacher in Newton, Iowa. Betty Sanborn died in 1975 at the age of 70, and the Sanborns had no children of their own, but they were survived by some nieces and nephews. In Betty's obituary, which I read, it was stated she once posed for a Grant Wood painting. And when Betty died, photos of her posing were found amongst her possessions. Now, I think there was a period of time in which people thought that somehow Grant was mimicking or joking with Ed Rowan in terms of using his face. And it wasn't until this friend found actual photographs of Betty posing that we knew that was not the case, that it was Betty, and she's shown holding the chicken in her hands. And that's kind of about Betty. If there's any questions, you just jump in. This is one of her artworks called Poppy Park that you're seeing there in the PowerPoint. If not, I'll go on to Mary. Or did somebody say something?
Oh, Paul, I was just going to ask, Poppy Park, I was trying to see if that was in Cedar Rapids, but any idea if that's a real place?
That I would guess it's in Omaha if it is a real place, but it looks like it's a South Caribbean island picture, maybe. They possibly traveled, but I don't know much about that aspect of her life. Well, let me go on with the third.
Paul,
Yeah,
I have a quick
tell me.
question.
Yeah.
Do you know how Grant Wood met Betty? Were they all at McKinley or?
Yeah, no, I don't think they were ever at the same school, but they would have citywide teachers meetings that he spotted her and evidently talked to her, noticing the resemblance with Ed, and got to know her. But I don't think they taught together. I could be wrong on that.
And Paul, that's one of the questions I have too. Do you or anybody in the audience know how Grant Wood picked his subjects? Was it the face? Was it their posture? Was it their essence? Any idea how he picked his subjects to pose?
That's a good idea. Anybody have an idea on that?
I know from my research, the book that I'm writing about the memorial window, that when he was looking for models for the soldiers, he was very, very interested in their face specifically. but he didn't want to ever really be representing a specific individual. He just always, in this case at least, wanted to combine features that would make it typical Iowan, you know, a member of the armed forces. But he would be caught staring into the faces of total strangers as he walked down the street.
I would like to thank to the Sean Ulmer and the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art for supplying some of these photos. Evidently, the woman that found the photographs and the file with Betty's husband, evidently those were sent to Cedar Rapids and they've ended up at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and we're really happy to have them, of course. Well, let me go on to the third character in the painting. That is a woman that was a good friend of Grant's named Mary Lackerstein, and she's the city woman in Appraisal. She was actually from Chicago originally and had come to Cedar Rapids as a director of city playgrounds. And at that time, it was under the control of the Social Welfare Council. And she had been a graduate of the School of Civics and Philanthropy at the University of Chicago. And then the city of Cedar Rapids took over the playground system and Mary was out of a job, but she decided to stay in Cedar Rapids. She liked Cedar Rapids and decided to, with her close friend Hazel Brown, open up a gift shop. And there were a series of gift shops, evidently. One of them was called Hobby House, which opened in 1923 and ran clear until 1956. She also helped to establish the Jane Boyd Community House, very active in cultural activities in Cedar Rapids and friend to many of the influential people of her time, including the Douglases, the Sinclairs, and of course, many of the artists like Grant Wood. Mary died in September of 1957. She was 73 years old at that time. And she had lived with Hazel Brown, probably a partnership, a relationship there. They lived on Blake Avenue in Cedar Rapids. And once Grant one time asked Mary if she minded what he had done to her in the painting. And Mary said back, no, Grant, I don't. But I could use that purse with the money in it if you would give it back to me. Any comments on Mary Lackerstein?
I'm curious, Paul, is there any chance in your notes there you have the street address from the house on Blake? And I only ask because I lived on Blake.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's available though. I think I've seen it, but tonight I didn't write it down.
So Joe, let me ask you, I never get the directions right, Cedar Rapids, were you south of the river or east of the river? How would they say that, of the Cedar on Blake?
It is in what they call the southeast side, which is confusing because it's kind of north of the river, depending on which part of the river you're looking at. So
Exactly.
Maybe Dorothy, could you show the appraisal again? Because I want to point something out there.
Absolutely.
If you can just zip back to that. Okay, I want you to note on appraisal, note Mary's profile there, her hat, her face. And then note that Betty is holding the chicken, so the chicken is looking away, but the chicken and Mary are kind of lined up. And I'll tell you more about that later. Thanks, Dorothy. You can go back down.
And Joe, what I wanted to share is the reason I was asking location is the story of Hazel Brown and of course of Mary is really interesting because one of the first things Grant did in Cedar Rapids was he took an old Turner mortuary building that was, I believe, south of the river, if I get those directions right. And he created like little mini apartments and Mary and Hazel had a store there, but it was a place where people could go live and they could do their art and just commune there in essence. And Grant often stopped by to see Hazel and Mary. And what I love about that, it was really his first, you could say, art colony that he put together. And of course, this is written in Hazel's book, Grant Wood and Marvin Cohn, Artists of an Era. But I think it's really cool that these women had such, I don't know, presence in his life. And of course, he he did a painting on one of them, and the other one wrote a book about him and Marvin Cohn. So I was just wondering if Blake was where this original Turner Mortuary building was at, where he basically had his first home.
I
Maybe.
don't know. I don't think so. Blake is a ways
Further.
out from the river,
Okay.
yes, and it's really kind of getting into what would have been at that time a more of an upscale area, because often they're big, lovely homes and things. But I'm awfully glad to see that picture of Mary, because I had never seen the picture of Mary, and reading Hazel Brown's books where she makes she tries to record what might have been a conversation that they had. And, you know, she talks about Grant coming into the shop and saying, "Girls, I have an idea." And so he always calls them girls. And so that was, I thought, this is great to see this picture.
Yeah.
And in answer to your question, 5 Turner Alley is on Second Avenue, and it's just really right down the street from the Museum of Art, coincidentally.
Well, I'll tell you some more things about appraisal. Grant thought that he for several years, he took major works to the Iowa State Fair. And he was really pleased with this one because he thought the farm people from Iowa would really enjoy appraisal. And there that year in 31, he won the sweepstakes prize, and that's the highest prize you can get in the art department. He had won it previously with Arnold Comes of Age. And he was right. The people really liked it, and therefore he got the sweepstakes prize. But there was a question attached to all of this because Grant didn't seem satisfied with this painting. And when he returned to Cedar Rapids, he sawed off the lower part, which showed some chicken wire and the rooster's feet. And we've got it there. You can see this is really a rare picture. I had never seen the original. I had always seen it with the bottom cut off. And here you can see the portion of the painting that he cut off. This came out of the Des Moines newspaper when it won the sweepstakes prize. And I guess I'd never really thought about it until I saw this. In fact, when he kind of renamed the painting too after he had cut off the bottom part, and he called it Clothes, Clothes. He gave this bottom part that had been cut off to his assistant, Arnold Pyle, and Arnold had a portion of it framed and kept it. Well, the name Clothes never seemed to stick with the altered painting. And so most people still called it the appraisal or appraisal. But this portion that was cut off shows the chicken's legs, and Dorothy had a slide of that previously. It's owned by the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, but it's on long-term loan to the Dubuque Museum of Art, and it's displayed next to the painting itself. But I'd really be interested if any of you have any ideas, why in the world would Grant saw off, it looks like 20% of the painting when it had won the grand prize, sweepstakes prize at the Iowa State Fair. Any thoughts on that?
This is Diane. I'm guessing that maybe he thought it had more impact on the actual face-to-face with the two women. Just a thought.
Yeah, move the focal point upward on the painting.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, the fence is kind of, or the chicken wire is kind of distracting a bit.
Yeah, that could be a reason too. I'm noticing some comments, the chicken feet from Barb. The chicken feet are ugly too.
Yeah, I was thinking nobody with legs like that would want it to be in a painting.
No. Well, it's probably a rarity. Now, maybe other people have, maybe some of you have seen this in its completed form. But in my years of researching, I had never seen it, so I was really pleased to see it.
What's unbelievable is his accuracy. You know, just when you look at the wealthier woman's coat, the chicken, it's just incredible the accuracy he got. It's just like you're looking at a photo versus a painting.
Well, we've talked a lot about in our Grant Wood country, seeing Grant Wood's work through Iowa eyes. But art historians have said some things about this painting too. And I'm going to read you some of the things that both Sue Taylor has said and also Trip Evans, two notable art historians. This is what Sue wrote in her book called Grant Wood Secrets. She says, although his public never embraced the new title Clothes, one can see why Wood proposed it, as the women's clothing conveys much of the work's content. The cloche hat worn by the lady visitor, her pearl earrings, fur trim coat, and clasp handbag, all were fashions of the moment, and Wood rendered them with loving exactitude to create an image of indulgent comfort. Sue Taylor brings sexual content into Grant's work with comments about the discomfort of puberty and also the grouping in adolescence as the chickens were grouped together in the shape, she calls it, of an erect phallus. Also, the placement of the adolescent chicken in the painting, again, adolescence, between a hen and a rooster, literally between a male and a female. She also says that the photograph she had seen of Rupke shows how he manipulated his source materials, changing the light color of her jacket to a deep olive green while retaining its woolly texture, dispensing with the buttons and relocating eloquent detail of the makeshift safety pin closure. Beneath the jacket, he added the familiar dot and circle patterned apron. It was his first painting after American Gothic, and in addition to the apron, he borrowed from some earlier work, the Eldon House porch, complete with slender support post and green trimmed screen door. The white post effectively frames the farm woman's handsome head, whose cap with its red stripe and pom-pom seems color coordinated with the comb and wattle of the bird she cradles. In the engaging ricochet of gazes, she looks searchingly at the city woman, who in turn glares directly at the view of the painting. Adjusting the bird's position in this picture, Wood painted it in profile rather than in three-quarter view. In the photograph, Rupke supports the chicken's breast with one hand and grasps its thigh with the other. In the painting, the farm woman clutches the bird possessively with arm and hands encircling its body. Was there another photograph mirroring the painting, as did Wood invent the rather lewd detail of a single finger protruding penis-like through the cockerel's gorgeous brown and white feathers? Evans connects this small phallus to the relationship between the two women in the painting in light of Rowan's gender-crossed figure in his work as the period's stereotypes concerning butch women like Lackerstein, who again modeled the stout urbanite. Perhaps the painting finger little penis is a sign, whether conscious or unconscious, underscoring the bird's role as a subject of desire. In the over narrative of market exchange, the farm woman's prized poultry will be sized up, purchased, and consumed, but other forms of having and wanting may operate sub rosa in the paintings. Chicken is a gay slang for a beautiful young boy, an object of homosexual interest, and on the most literal level, the poking finger evokes an unmentionable fact of rural life, the sexual abuse of animals reported to Alfred Kinsey in 1948 by about 1/3 of his male subjects who grew up on the farm. There was also the story in Return from Bohemia of Grant trying to bring a chicken back to life by rubbing salt into the dead bird's wing because a hired hand had said that Ida McKinney, the president's wife, had been brought back to life by an injection of salt in the arm. Well, that's a lot of stuff, isn't it? And unfortunately, our historians see many things that I don't see in the paintings. I have a very different reference frame, I guess. Any questions or any thoughts on this? I admire Sue's work a lot, but it's just very different. I like to read art historians because it gives me other perspectives, but I just never would have thought some of the things that are pointed out.
And Paul, something I noticed as you were reading that, look at the farm woman's hat. Notice it's red and then it's kind of oatmeal, then it's red. And then even though it's kind of ribbed at the bottom, it matches the chicken's head. Got red on top with the chicken, got kind of that oatmeal color. Then you've got red again. And then if you go into the body of the chicken, you have a little bit of that oatmeal ribbed look. So he kind of replicated the chicken's head in the hat. And maybe I'm stretching. It's just kind of like red, oatmeal, red. And you've got that with the chicken's head too.
Well, I think I've mentioned to you, I've got a friend in Butte, Randy Lingeling, that's very knowledgeable on Grant Wood. And I read some of the things he's written, and he pointed out to me something I hadn't noticed, but in Mary's face, she has kind of a hooked nose that's almost quote unquote beak-like. And then she's got a double chin, which is mirrored again in the chicken's comb that hangs down beneath that beak. And he points out that that's the reason the chicken is in the direction it is, so that viewers will see some kind of a relationship there. Thoughts on that?
I don't
Or
think,
on-
I
yeah.
don't think the chicken wants to be sold to the other lady.
Trying to-
He's looking away from her.
Yeah. If they don't make contact, he's okay, huh?
Yeah.
Let me tell you some things that Tripp Evans wrote in his book that's titled Grant Wood. In Appraisal, Wood presents two women whose dress and attitudes are intended to summon their opposing worlds. Facing a sophisticated, fashionably attired woman from the city, a humbly dressed farmer's wife presents a rooster for the woman's inspection. As traditional reading of this work suggests, the appraisal in this instance is centered less on the sale of the bird than on the women's evaluation of one another. Not surprisingly, the artist portrays the country woman more sympathetically than her urban counterpart, despite her close-pinned jacket and frumpy knit hat. She seems nobler and more monumental than her overdressed, double-chinned, and myopic companion. The city woman's eyes appear to be closed. She too is incapable of appreciating what she sees. And then Tripp goes on to suggest that Lackerstein, knowing who Mary is, the woman is a lesbian in a relationship that some at this time called a Boston marriage. Mary was known to have a salty vocabulary and a campy sense of humor. He goes on that the woman's mutual appraisal might concern something more intimate than a business transaction or a straightforward juxtaposition. Rural urban type is suggested in a number of ways in the painting. More striking, of course, is the rooster that visually links the women. Not only does the bird act as a phallic pun, it is a cock after all, but the country women's disembodied left thumb also appears to endow Lackerstein's figure with a small phallus. Projecting from the fur lining of her coat and paring the bird's feathers, this element appears to consummate the women's exchange. Given Wood's previous iconography, the painting's background provides another indication of the city woman's masculinity. For the red barn with which she is associated in this image and the white farmhouse before which the country woman stands recall the gendered structures with which the male and female figures of American Gothic are themselves aligned. He also writes concerning the women who were originally behind a chicken wire fence and also eliminated overlapping lower torsos of the figures when he sawed off the bottom third of the painting after the Iowa State Fair. So lots of thoughts there too, again with very heavy sexual indications. Thoughts on this?
Well, I feel very naive because honestly, when I look at this, I've always loved it just as a beautiful picture of a chicken and, you know, two interesting faces. And I love the colors of the art. And I guess that's just way too simple. I didn't read any of this other stuff into it. So, you know, this is kind of catching me off guard because I would never have thought about any of those things that the art critics are, you know, saying.
Yeah, I think that's the purpose of an art historian, is to raise some of those questions in our minds.
If I
and-
might chip in a minute, I just thought it looked more like a negotiation than an appraisal, because the woman on the left has that look on her like, you're not going to put one over on me. You think I'm a dumb country woman, but
Right.
she just has that expression of, oh no, you're not going to put one over on me kind of thing. I didn't read anything sexual into it. That's just, but you know, some people can find all that stuff in there, but it was just a simple farm painting to me. But
Well, you know, I would love, this is an ongoing conversation that we've had off and on among various groups of people related to this forum for quite a while. And I think Paul makes a good point. You know, there's a historian's perspective, there's an artist perspective and interpretation, there's art historians' interpretations, and he is accessing, you know, two of the premier Grant Wood scholars in the nation, in Trip Evans and Sarah Sue Taylor. And for those of us who grew up around there, we see all the things that look so authentic to the area. Now, in terms of closeted identity and subliminal messages, there's always discussion as to if somebody reads something sexualized into it or related to an identity as a part of the context of the artist's full life, the rest of the artist's life, we can't possibly know, maybe the artist doesn't even know to what degree those elements crop up, you know, subliminally, consciously, unconsciously. You know, it could be a wink wink, it could be, I put that in there. You know, we just will never know, you know, to what degree his repressed sexual, you know, his sexuality played a role in his painting, or any other artist's, you know, sexuality. You know, people sexualize paintings all the time, you know, based on their interpretations. So I do trust the scholars to know something about, you know, interpreting the art, the history of the art pieces, but we all can have our own reactions. That's the beauty of it. We don't have to buy into any of it.
And that's what Grant cared about, was that people had a reaction to his art. I think it's been published where Nan took offense to some of the comments and things to his art in general, but he's like, no, I want to hear it. You know, I want to hear what people, how they interpret it, how they see it. He thought that was much better than no reaction at all.
This is, oh,
Go
excuse
ahead.
me. Elaine. Well,
go ahead.
when I taught at Grant Wood School and we celebrated Grant Wood's 100th birthday, this was one of the paintings, you know, a print of it that we had up on the easels. We had all sorts of Grant Wood stuff, and we talked about it, and the children wrote about it and everything. Tonight is the first night I've ever seen the finger down at the bottom of it. I mean, I led my class through a writing activity about this. So I just think it's hysterical. But now I can't unsee it. I mean, to me, it's spot on with Trip Evans and Sue Taylor. And just like when Martha Booth mentioned about the noses on the ladies and Daughters of Revolution, I never had noticed that until Martha mentioned it. And now I can't unsee it. I mean, to me, it's very clear. And I think Grant Wood was a magnificent artist and knew how to just layer it in. I mean, you could look at their hats and that would be enough, or you could take it on many levels beyond that. But I'm just stunned that I never saw that finger until now. So thank you. I'm glad I know about it now.
Well, and I'm
And that-
looking at some, I know, I feel you, Sylvia. I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, and I did want to acknowledge that, you know, when Tripp wrote his book, a lot of people had a lot of strong reactions to a lot of things in Tripp's book. I will say that Tripp wrote his book in, I think, 2010, and there has been a movement, you know, in recent decades to move away from erasure of a person's identity when studying their art, you know. So it may make some of us uncomfortable to look at that interpretation, or we don't agree with it. However, there's been this long time kind of suppression of especially in the LGBTQIA community, of acknowledging that piece of an artist's identity as relevant to their paintings and the discussion and presentation of it. And so so a lot of that's happening as we speak. And so, you know, we just kind of dip our toe into that in this forum so far. But we're certainly aware of some folks who are doing a lot of work in, you know, trying to not figure it out, but present maybe a more holistic look through a different lens of an artist than we're accustomed to or have been accustomed to. Am I saying that okay? I don't know. I just think there's a lot of, it's provocative for sure. And not everybody's going to want to even discuss that element of it.
Well, and Elaine, we're going to have to keep this quiet because the legislature will probably pass a law and this will be a banned painting because they're going to protect the children of Iowa. Of course, if they have a teacher who doesn't notice it, they're safe. But anyway, no, I find it fascinating because to me, it just adds another level of intrigue into these paintings. I mean, this artwork is not just a flat picture on a canvas or on a piece of masonite or whatever. There's great depth to the picture, and you know, I appreciate getting some understanding that's beyond just, you know, oh, there's a chicken, you know, kind of thing. So thank you. I'll be quiet.
Right. No, it's okay. But another clear piece is the class tension. You know, we could look at things through the lens of social class. We could look through things through the lens of women, rural versus urban, all of that, you know, more in depth. You know, there's a lot of filters we can use with any piece of art. So
just one more thing. When you're showing something like this to young children, there is a tendency, and I was teaching first grade, and I know this sounds crazy, but girls, and boys sometimes, but they would look at the painting and they would point to a particular, and not just this one, but to all of them. And they would say, I'm that girl. And I remember when we were doing this, the majority of the children were, of the girls were like, I'm that girl. Nobody wanted to be this woman, even though she was wealthy. And even though that wasn't part of our big discussion about it, they intuitively related to this woman. And for some reason, maybe this woman looked kind of stern and, like a old grandmother that they had encountered, or a great grandmother or something. But that whole thing, and if you've worked with young children, maybe you've had that same experience, but you're trying to read a book or something, and then somebody's saying, I'm that girl or I'm that boy, because they relate to that image and that's who they want to be. So anyway, now I really mean it.
No,
So
well,
I have a
we-
question. I have a question for Paul.
Yeah.
So I seem to have heard somewhere that Tripp thought that the model for the farmer woman was a man at one point, and it wasn't until the kind of the surfacing of the photo of Betty as as the actual person who modeled for the painting. It wasn't until that point that photo there that Dorothy just brought up. So it was kind of like saying, no, it wasn't a man that posed. It was actually this woman, Betty. Wasn't that the case, Paul, that he
It
thought it
was.
was a man?
Yeah, it was Ed Rowan. But we don't know what Grant would have, what he was irritated with Ed for a period of time when he first formulated this picture. But we really don't know how Grant would have painted it when he was a bit irritated with Ed. Because most of the people that knew Ed would recognize that as they thought being him. And so those stories came out that he had actually used Ed Rowan as his model from his mind. But when these photos came out, we knew that it had actually been Betty that had modeled for it.
Right.
One thing too, with the painting, and I throw this out to all of you, in many of Grant's works, he appears to go back a couple of decades. He'll show a handheld plow, for instance, or he'll show a wagon bringing the kids to school, something more from the teens. But this is done in 1931, and as I look at it, it appears to me that it's been a current, at the time period, he wants it to be a current painting, because I think that's pretty much the way women looked in 1931. Any thoughts on that?
I have a few thoughts, and
Yeah.
this would have
Go.
never crossed my mind until a few years ago. I wrote this big historic piece on women's fashion in the 1890s, heading into the 1920s. And when I looked into cloche hats, it brought me back to this painting. So one interpretation, thinking that Grant Wood often painted things a few decades before the actual time, would suggest that if this were say late 1910s into the 1920s, the cloche hat was created in, I think, 1919 or something like that. And it wasn't old people's wear, it was young ladies' wear. The whole flapper outfit, right down to that kind of a beaded purse, that was an outfit that suggests that, oh, well, look at this older woman trying to look young, right? So that brings a whole new interpretation to it. And if you think, well, say Grant painted this to look like a scene that happened yesterday in 1931, that also brings a new interpretation. Look at this older lady wearing the cloche hat. Maybe it was more appropriate for her to be in fashion and in line with her age, and she's still hanging on to it, not letting go as it's starting to get dated and aged. And so I that's the fun. And we were talking about this just earlier. The fun of art interpretation is to think, oh, did he mean this or did he mean that? And one thing we know for sure is Grant loved to infuse different reads into his paintings so that everyone could debate them till the cows come home. But I think oftentimes there are enough clues like Portrait of Arnold, where if you do your history on symbolism and look at all the things around Portrait of Arnold, there's no mistaking that he was very intentional about some of the off the radar sexual identity things that are in many of these paintings. But again, the whole fun of, did he mean this or did he mean that? I think that's interesting. But the whole cloche hat thing, I find interesting, because I don't know which way that should go, but there are a few different reads there too.
Thanks, Jill, and thanks for correcting my pronunciation. Cloche, I think I was pronouncing it cloche. So you can tell my knowledge of women's clothing, I guess. Thank you. Well, let's go on just a little bit here and talk about where the painting is now and maybe a little bit about that. It's actually owned by the Carnegie Stout Public Library in Dubuque. And right now it's on long-term loan to the Dubuque Museum of Art, which is kind of right down the street from each other. And Steve Hankin, who's a member of our group here tonight, he gave me some really interesting information about a Jones County connection, Anamosa being in Jones County, with the library. And he told me that Mrs. Stout grew up in Monticello in Jones County, where her father and grandfather, whose names were Charlie Wales and grandfather Samuel Wales, they ran one of the early general merchandise stores along the old military road. And later, her father got more into the buying and selling of grain and livestock, but quit to accept a job as a manager for the Hotel Julian in Dubuque. He was quite successful as an innkeeper, and he later built his own hotel called the Wales, but unfortunately it burned down. His daughter then married a very successful businessman who died rather young in Chicago and left his widow Clara with several $1 million in his estate. Hence, the Stout Carnegie Library became a reality with the money she donated. So I thank Steve for that information, just another connection here. Actually, the library at the time of the purchase bought 2 of Grant Wood's paintings. And the other one that you'll see at the Dubuque Museum of Art is called Victorian Survival. And it's a portrait of Grant's aunt, Tilly, on his father's side. She's the one whose neck has kind of been lengthened to accentuate her straight-laced character. And it also shows a telephone, which seems to mock her a little and encroach on her conservative space. And goodness, over the years, and I think the contract is there, Dorothy, someplace too in your PowerPoint. Yeah, here's the contract for the purchase. You can kind of read through that. It's got some notes here and there, but it's signed by Grant. $350. Well, the library has certainly had, actually the Carnegie Stout Library has had offers to sell appraisal. A more recent one came in 2016 when the John Surovic Art Gallery in Palm Beach, Florida, on behalf of an anonymous client who wished to purchase it. And that was, I think, over $6 million at that time. But the library, the Dubuque Art Center, and the city itself recognized that this piece really brings priceless value and recognition. And it's one of the few museums in the nation to house house at least 2 of Grant's more well-known works. They also said that they get at least 3 calls per year with serious offers to purchase the painting. In fact, a lesser known work of Grant sold for nearly $7 million in 2006. But right after World War II, right after, or before World War II, after Grant's death, 1942, there was an idea at the University of Iowa of having an art collection at the Union. And some of the recent graduates thought a Grant Wood would really be perfect for an initial purchase. He had been a instructor there. But the Dubuque Library was quickly turned down the offer that the university might have made. But how did the library really first become interested in Grant Wood? Well, in 1920, works by both Grant and Marvin Cohn were featured in an exhibit in May at Roshek's Brothers department store. And they were shown in the store's furniture department. And this was 10 years before Grant rose to any kind of prominence, of course. A writer for the Dubuque local newspaper wrote, "One of the most interesting exhibitions of paintings that have been seen in Dubuque for a long time is on exhibition on the third floor furniture department of Roshek Brothers Company. They are the work of Marvin D. Cohn and Grant Wood, two young Iowa artists of Cedar Rapids. Mr. Wood has found many subjects for his pictures right here in Iowa. Both the young men also were in France during the war and have put onto the canvas many of the things they saw abroad. About 40 pictures comprise the collection, which will be shown at Roshek's for the rest of the week." And then I think I mentioned to you that Randy Lingeling, who is really responsible for so much of the collection there at the Dubuque Museum of Art, he's the one that pointed out to me the beak-nosed, double-chinned woman and the beak on the chicken itself. Any ideas on this or any comments you'd like to share?
So Paul, when the library bought this, they bought it directly from Grant? Is that what we can interpret?
Yes, they bought it directly from Grant. I think they bought Victorian Survival first, and then they bought the appraisal. I think it was in that order.
I heard that the survival one, that painting, is of a Mrs. Pete.
Oh, I could have that wrong, Steve. What did I say? Her first name? It could be Pete, yeah.
So Paul, do you have any idea why? I mean, obviously it's a beautiful piece of art, but are there other pieces of art that garner as much interest as appraisal as far as individual, art collectors? Like you said, an anonymous person offered 6 million. Are there other Grant Wood pieces that people are offering great amounts for?
Well, I think any of his major works are in the millions. Maybe even some of the Indian Creek paintings are pretty high now. I don't really know what kind of price is it. There is, one for sale right now, or it was anyway, and some of you are aware that it's the portrait of Nan painting that is for sale. But there's been no one that has bought it. And what I've been told, and this could be right or it could be wrong, I've been told that it was altered during possibly when it was in the possession of Nan Wood herself. Maybe a little bit of a facelift was given. I'm not sure. I don't know what the damage was, and they've tried to restore it to its original, but I think that's the reason it's still for sale and not in a major collection. Now, maybe some of you know more about that than I do.
It's in Lincoln, Nebraska, and
Keachel.
Keachel, yes, Buck Keachel. And there was an article that mentioned about it being altered, but I've only seen the one. You probably could Google it, but I've only seen the one article that talks about that. But yeah, it was up for 15 million or something like that at one time.
Debbie, did Nan ever speak about that?
No, not to my recollection, no. What I do remember, and someone had asked in the chat about, did any of his models, how they felt about how he portrayed them. And then I think we all know that he told her, no one will recognize you. And I know she mentioned to me on more than one occasion, she repeated and this kind of told me maybe a a little bit bothered her, but she repeated what was written in something about it was the face could sour milk or something. I can't remember the exact quotation, but she did mention that to me a couple of times. You know, you got to remember, I was a youngster, but we did have conversations once in a while.
That would have gone to Nan upon Grant's death, because that was one of the paintings he always kept on his wall here on East Court Street. So I'm sure Nan owned it for a period of time. But
She didn't mention, Paul, I'm sorry for interrupting. I guess what I was talking about was the reaction or the altering of her face for American Gothic. That's when she talked about the face that would sour milk, not the portrait of Nan. I don't remember her talking about that painting at all.
It might have been sold shortly after Grant's death. I don't know.
She did, I think I've mentioned that Nan was on To Tell the Truth twice, a 10-year span. And I had looked for those episodes on YouTube, couldn't find them, even though you can find To Tell the Truth. So years ago, I contacted Fremantle Media. I believe they own the rights. And I was able to get DVDs of both episodes. And because of, you know, copyright and licensing and all that good stuff, I am not allowed to publish them or put them on YouTube or anything, but I can share like with a personal friend or whatever. So in one of those, and I'll have to look at them again, at the end, one of the panel asks her about Portrait of Nan. And at that time, she didn't know where it was. She says, I would love to know where it was. I'll watch it again. I think it was like 1980 or something. I'll have to look. But she mentions that painting, Portrait of Nan.
It was bought by a senator of Wisconsin.
That's
and-
right. That's
Mhm.
right, because we talked about that painting, didn't we, Dorothy?
Yeah, it ended up in a Wisconsin museum just in Madison. And the family just recently sold it to, I guess it's is it Kintel?
Keachel.
Keachel, thank you. Yeah, but it was with that museum in Madison for many years.
Dorothy or Elaine, I'm seeing a lot of 63 chat comments. Maybe you could tell us what our group is saying on chat. And we can't hear you, Elaine.
Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, let's see. After the whole conversation about the little finger underneath the chicken's thigh. Let's see. Ever wondered if I just wondered if Grant Wood had ever recorded anything about what he wanted to capture when painting or creating another type of artwork. As a lit student, I often read critiques about short stories that have been interpreted similarly to tonight's interpretation, but I've often thought some ideas were a bit of a stretch. I think it's legit to compare literature to interpreting any art form, you know. So anyway, and that whole notion of is it a stretch or not, you know, when you're interpreting something, you know. I don't know what you would say about that after studying it so much, Paul or Dorothy or anybody else.
I was able to see two pretty famous authors in Judaism. One of them was Isaac Bashevis Singer, and the other was Chaim Potok. And I met them in person. I was able to be with them and then listen to them give a lecture. And I feel very honored to be able to say that. And I know they're not artists like Grant Wood. They're not painters. They're not that type of an artist. But in each case, they were asked about how people interpret their stories. One of them purposefully wrote his story to tell some of these messages, and the other said something similar to Mark Twain in the fact that you know, this is just a story. I want you to enjoy it. So like anybody else, I would say artists are doing one or the other, and we are interpreting them. And there's actually no way to know what somebody was thinking when they do these things unless they're around for you to ask.
That's a good point, Barb. And another question, did any of the models ever get upset with their depictions? I think we've touched on that through the last several years from time to time, you know. If I'm not mistaken, it seems that nobody really got upset with him.
Oh, yeah.
Did
There was a guy running the Chamber of Commerce in Cedar Rapids at the time, and there was a big kind of tribute roast of him. And Grant Wood did I think it was charcoal, did a depiction of him as the Greek god of wine, and it showed him as a fountain and holding grapes in a little rotund.
Oh, right.
And the guy left town. He was so embarrassed. He split and was never seen in Cedar Rapids again. And I've actually kind of been digging into that story because surely there are relatives, and do they know of that history and whatnot? But yeah, that's at least one story.
Oh, that's right,
And-
right.
And that man's name was Charles Munson. I just happened to turn in the Hazel Brown book to that picture. And boy, I'll tell you, it's a very insulting picture. And I can see why that man would have wanted to leave town. It was 1928, and apparently it belongs to the Staymates, or it did. But it's really, and the man is naked except for some grapes, which would cause a bit of a stir.
Oh boy, Joe, yeah, if you do that, let's bring that presentation out to play,
Do a
Joe,
TikTok on that one.
or something. Yeah.
It's in the works.
Oh, good. See what else we have here.
I also thought I would just mention that the god was Bacchus, which is where the word bacchanalian comes from. So if you look up the meaning of bacchanalian, there's some very interesting meanings of bacchanalian, meaning, where you have a lot of wine, dancing, and song. It also means orgy. So there you go.
Okay, yeah. Let's see. We're still in the chat here. Thanks, Pat, for sharing an excerpt, a link to an excerpt. I don't know if you all read that in the chat. That Wood was where did that come from? Art Students League of New York. I'm not sure who the person was who wrote that. But go ahead and read that in the chat if you'd like to, folks. Somebody's wondering if Grant Wood's earlier impressionistic paintings are worth a lot of money these days.
I can give a point of reference on that only. So my great uncle had an expansive collection of early works by Grant. Most of the paintings and lithographs were donated to the Davenport, which is now the Figge, and a number of them were willed to family members. So that was to my dad's generation, to nephews of Frank and Clara's. So after that generation pretty much has passed away, our family and my uncle and aunt's family decided to sell some of the impressionistic paintings through Sotheby's. One was called Café des Palais and one was called Lazy Afternoon. And if you go to the Sotheby's site or do a Google search, I think they were sold in the 20-something thousand dollar range, maybe close to, 10 years ago. I can't remember, but that would give you an idea of what, and they were obviously long before Grant was well known, but that might give you a point of reference. But they're still on the Sotheby's side. I've searched them a couple of times. So Café des Palais and Lazy Afternoon.
Oh, that's interesting. Thanks, Deb.
Yeah,
That's great.
It's fun to kind of like look in family photos and see that painting in the background. I after it was sold, of course, I wondered who bought it, but they never tell you. And the fellow said it got a very good home. So
Oh,
yeah.
that's great. Okay, and Steve Hankin weighed in. The 10-year difference on a different topic. The 10-year difference in age between Wood and his wife might have a bit of a twist with the chicken painting. Speaking of interpretations, I don't know. I don't know precisely what you're getting at, but oh goodness. So we need to make a little bit of time. We have so thank you so much, Paul and Dorothy. I mean, we had a lively discussion. That's what this is about. It's so fun. And keep reaching out to each other if you can. And if you can't find an email to do that, hit somebody up that you do, and we'll connect you. We'll connect the dots for you, for sure. And so next we've got Angela Evans, one of our brand new forum participants this year, has a couple poems she wrote for us to read this evening to kick it off before Dawn takes us home with her words of inspiration. So Angela, are you ready?
Thanks, Elaine. I can't believe how this conversation tonight kind of goes along with my poem too. So Sylvia had talked about women's groups a couple weeks ago, and she had mentioned Moms for Freedom. So I went ahead and researched that a little bit, and it's actually Moms for Liberty. And there had been an editorial in the Gazette about the Moms for Liberty are running the State House, and you can probably find that. I decided in my poem to stick with Moms for Freedom because I like that. When I explained it, what they stand for, to a couple of my social work friends, my one friend said, well, that doesn't sound like it's either freedom or liberty. So that's where this kind of started. Let me see if I can share. Okay, can you see that? Okay. Ban this, Moms for Freedom. It seems our state is ransom. You took down a school. They think you are cool. You are trying to build a fiefdom. Let me see if I can. Okay, and then I have a little sunroof for you. Mix home Scrabble roots with city smart gumption. Meet Grant Wood. And that's what I got for tonight. Let me.
Oh, that's fun. So you're going to become it looks like you're a natural with the short form. There you go.
Thank you. Let me see if I can.
All right. Well, Dawn, are you ready to take this session home?
I hope so. I hope it's going to work for me this evening. I practiced, so it should. So you just have to be patient just a moment. Okay. And kind of like, Angela said her poems went with this evening. And I think that there's some elements in this presentation that really do help us realize how artists, whether they're visual artists or poets or writers, are using different forms to help push the edge of social and political consciousness. So that's what we're going to be talking about this evening is the American sonnet. So as much as we've talked a lot about how form and rhyme was really the convention of the time that Grant Wood was living. There was obviously some experimentation with free verse or blank verse at the time. And as we know, people like Jay Sigmund say, I just don't do this well. And so it was a challenge for a lot of people who grew up thinking about poetic form as being rhyming in some aspects. But the Americans, they break the rules, right? So we're going to talk about the American sonnet. And I don't know if many of you have heard of the American sonnet. It is basically, it's a 14-line poem. And it has a volta in it. I know I've talked before about how the sonnet is really an argument. It's one part of it, the top part talks about one thing, and then there's going to be a change or a turn. That's the volta. And then it's going to come home at the end in a different way and kind of flip things around a little bit. So I think about, how Betty, she in the chicken where 3/4 and the light was changed a little bit. That's kind of what the sonnet's doing here. But I want to talk about how the sonnet has evolved in the United States. And really, this is kind of our own thing. And I think about, regionalism that Grant Wood really, he's kind of the originator of that, at least with, his style. And he adapted a lot of things from and used a lot of his experience in Europe to help, with the eventual style he became known for. But anyway, so I just have a little bit of a passage here, and this comes from this book, The American Sonnet. I don't know if you can see it or not. It's a new book. It's an anthology of poems and essays. It's a University of Iowa Press piece, and I have it on the next page. I haven't noted, but it's edited by Dora Maklick and Laura T. Smith. And it's marvelous. If you're a sonnet geek, it's amazing. So in 1849, that year, the North American Review, which, as you may or may not remember or know, it is now a publication located at UNI. Wasn't at the time, but it is one of the oldest literary reviews in the United States, and it's been at UNI since James Hurst was the editor, and I can't tell you the year, but anyway, it's been here for quite a while. So in 1849, William Cullen Bryant's translation of Afro-Cuban poets Placido's, a roundup of the female poets of America, praised the poems of writer and women's rights activist Elizabeth Oakes Smith, while noting that she has shown a partiality for the form of verse generally called a sonnet, which is not entitled to be called so, or to be so called. So he's not really taking exception with what Smith is doing, but rather he's saying that basically those, who wish to think about what that perfect sonnet is, it's rhyming, it looks a certain way. There's the Shakespearean or English sonnet, there's the Petrarchian or Italian sonnet, right? So Smith is doing something different. And he says, in this country, the rules seem to be set at defiance, only that of the number of lines being regarded. So there's, women causing those problems again with poetry, but he says that this is in a good way. And it's something it's very unique to America. So so we can think about the American sonnet. It really has this tradition. It's an early-ish tradition of being socially and politically engaged, even radical. And you're going to see some examples of that. And the reason I bring this up is because, when we think about, the conventions of the time in the 30s and 40s, but obviously we have a very contemporary interpretation that we as writers will be sharing. Right, we can really push the boundaries of what we've come to know as a sonnet. So when you think about the aesthetic debates that have accompanied the American sonnet, as generations of marginalized writers, especially Indigenous writers, Black, feminist, Jewish, queer, question the politics and value of the sonnet form for literary representation, they reshaped this prestige form to their needs, and it continues today, and it's amazing. American sonnets been long used by marginalized writers, and I think about our discussion tonight about the appraisal, right? What were the messages? So marginalized writers are using this form, which was this prestige form, to claim literary and social space and voice as their negotiations with prosodic and thematic conventions form a transhistorical discourse and a transformative literary tradition. So the sonnet is being owned by Americans in their own voice for their own social and political and cultural reasons. And we're going to see some really great examples of that. And, and I know obviously not everybody here's a poet, but I think it's an interesting history and something that even if you're not a poet and you did want to write something, and even if it turns out to be kind of a prose piece or a flash fiction, that means, short fiction or even flash CNF, creative nonfiction, you might consider, maybe I could use a form like this. I mean, why not? So this particular poem, it's called Sonnet to an American Painter Departing for Europe. And I really thought about Grant Wood when I selected this. This is by William Cullen Bryant. And next to Longfellow and Wadsworth, back in the, in earlier American literature, Bryant was a huge figure. I don't know if you all know the poem Thanatopsis, but he's the author of that poem. That's one that is a favorite in my family. But just look at the form of this. This does not look like a traditional sonnet. And the spacing is different. So I'm just going to read this. And I also wanted to just say that I think that this poem is about the painter Thomas Cole. I don't know that for sure, but the timing would be right. And the subject would be right too. Thomas Cole was the painter who started the Hudson River School of Art, which is so famous. And anyway, so his family immigrated from Britain to the United States when he was very young. And then he left to go study in Europe, but he came back. So anyway, this is Sonnet to an American Painter Departing for Europe. Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thy own glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, rocks rich with summer garlands, solemn streams, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves. Fair scenes shall greet thee where thou goest, fair but different everywhere, the trace of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins, from the lowest glen to where life shrinks from the fierce alpine air. Gaze on them till the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep that earlier, wilder image bright. So that's just a really beautiful, romantic and almost traditional subject of that pastoral subject that we talked about before for forms like the sonnet. But he's put this in a box, in a package that looks different than the traditional sonnet. So he liked what Elizabeth Oakes Smith was doing. Okay, don't do that. Okay, this next one, I'm not going to read all of these. I'm just going to mention these famous these sonnets and the evolution. This is by Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I couldn't talk about the American sonnet without talking about her. She's one of the most famous sonneteers who led a very controversial and untraditional lifestyle, but she influenced many, many future women who wrote sonnets and also men. So I wanted to at least mention her and look her up. I also put a link to this presentation in the chat. So if you're interested in following up later, I recommend that you do that. E.E. Cummings, those of you who have had American literature, you've seen E.E. Cummings. I'm surprised to see the name here capitalized because the way that he pushed against convention is he used lowercase all the time. Except I can see one place down here where he started a sentence, two sentences, and he used a capital letter. But so this is using little fragments of these kind of meaningful political expressions, like next to, of course, God, America, I love you, land of the pilgrims, and so forth. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early, my country, 'tis of thee, or 'tis of centuries come and go. So he really does not use punctuation for the most part. And this is supposed to be he really admired the sonnet, but his thing was to break the rules. I thought this was a very interesting piece. This is supposed to be a speech that somebody's giving. You can see the quotations. And the very last line, the 14th line of this sonnet is, he spoke and drank rapidly a glass of water. So there's some irony in this as well. Langston Hughes, I think we're all familiar with the name Langston Hughes. This is from 7 Moments of Love, an unsonnet sequence in blues. And what makes this really different, this is called a blues or jazz sonnet, and it's a persona poem. In a persona poem, they speak in the voice of a character. So they have invented a character, like, you think about the ekphrastic poems that you're going to write, you might be inventing a character, right? So anyway, this is written in the tradition of the Harlem Renaissance. But what makes this really interesting, an unsonnet sequence, I don't know if many of you know about the sonnet crown, which is, it's a series of 15 linked sonnets. If you do half of that, that's called a corona. So 7 Moments of Love, he's talking about, this is a sonnet corona, but what it doesn't do is, it has 14 lines, and I've looked at this sonnet, 6 of them have the 14 lines. The linked sequence would be, if you see here, if this radio was good, I'd get KDQ. That would be from the line at the end of number 2. So if you look then down to a human gets lonesome if there aren't 2 at the bottom of this sonnet, that would be the beginning of number 4, or a slight variation on it. So that's what makes a traditional sonnet sequence. What he does in the 7th, so the 7th is supposed to repeat lines from 1 through 6. He makes it an epistolary, that means a letter. He makes it a letter. It says, Dear Jack. And it's 23 lines, and it ends with it, it's signed love and then the name. So he's really breaking the rules, and he's doing it proudly. And this is a place where this particular cultural identity is able to reside in a way that's authentic and true to the experience. This is from Elizabeth Bishop, Sonnet of Intimacy. Elizabeth Bishop is standard in so much poetry. She was a queer poet, and not many people knew that. And this particular poem, and she traveled a lot. She lived in Brazil for a short period of time. She wrote Sonnet of Intimacy there. And this is basically this very beautiful, kind of pastoral scene until the very end, when she talks about the smell of cow manure is delicious. The cattle look at me unenviously. And when there comes a sudden stream and hiss, accompanied by a look not unmalicious. All of us, animals, unemotionally partake together of a pleasant piss. So she's writing about something that would not be the appropriate subject for a sonnet. But here she is, she's doing it. So style and form, it's transnational, it's human, and it's beautiful. Here's a really marvelous example of a minimalist sonnet. I had some examples from Gertrude Stein that I chose not to share. I suggest you look those up in here. Amazing. But this minimalist sonnet I will read. This is called The Beginning. And she uses, Mona Van Dien uses rhyme, but she's using what would be called, oh gosh, I looked this up. It's just one, for the most part, each line is 2 syllables. There's some that are more, but that would be 1 metric foot. But here's how she's breaking the rules. The end of passion may refashion a friend. Eyes meet in fear of such dear defeat. The heart's core unbroken cringes. The soul's door swings open on its hinges. So some of us who like to write short poems, hey, here's American sonnet style that might work for you. Lucille Clifton, this is, she is so well known in literature, American literature, women's literature, Black literature. And this one it's a short line sonnet, and it takes advantage of shape and also the potential here, right? So you've got some lines that are longer, some that are just, it's 1 syllable. And this is in the voice of her dead husband. So love that she broke the rules for that. This is Ted Kooser. I know almost all of us know who Ted Kooser is. And Iowa has a right to claim him as an Iowa poet. He was born and raised in Iowa, went to school at Iowa State, got his teaching degree. He taught in Iowa, in Marshalltown, actually, for quite a while. And then he went to work for an insurance company. And then that's what took him to Nebraska. That's how he became really affiliated with Nebraska. But his voice is so regional. I think about him I almost, from a poetry point of view, I place him in a very particular regionalist category, much like I would Grant Wood on the art side. But this is a birthday poem, and he's always writing about life in the rural Midwest. And he's 87 years old. I don't know if any of you follow him on Facebook. Well, you can't, if you wanted to follow him now on Facebook, you couldn't, because he can't accept any more people. And he said, hey, I'm really happy with my 4,000 followers. I'm not going to get an author's page. So anyway, but yeah, this is Ted Kooser. He writes a lot of 14-line poems. I don't think I've ever seen him talk about these as sonnets, but they are beautiful, and they really, this is not from this book, but I do believe that they definitely qualify and belong there. Sylvia Plath, I'm not going to read this, but she wrote this one in college, and she was really a fairly famous sonneteer. The line length is longer than the typical sonnet. She uses a much more feminine and delicate rhyme, and she really pushes against the constraint of form, which was kind of her brand. She was on brand. Here's James Wright, also an amazing poet who wrote this prose sonnet. It's basically an Italian sonnet with iambic pentameter. There's really no rhyme in it, but the way it's set up, well, I think there is some rhyme, but anyway, it's just really cleverly done, so skillful. So writing a prose sonnet, hey, go for it. I just have finished reading this book for my MFA packet. It's a book called Curie by Ellen Bryant Boyd, famous poet who actually taught in Iowa for a while and lived for several years in Iowa before moving on. And I can't remember, I think she teaches in Virginia now. But this is a beautiful portrait sonnet. It's not traditional, it's reflective, it doesn't rhyme. And it's all set in the pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu, as well as World War I. So just really the impact that it had on rural life. This one is Diane Seuss. If you follow poetry, you know Diane Seuss is a Midwestern poet from Michigan. She grew up in poverty, and she memorializes quite a bit of that in her work. But her sonnets are this is from Frank Sonnets that won the Pulitzer Prize last year for poetry. And it has what is called a sprung rhyme. And it also has a really interesting meter to it. And if you decide that you're going to write in this style, you should definitely say, you know, whatever the name of your poem is, and you should say after Diane Seuss, or somebody might think it's a prose poem. So I definitely highly recommend Frank Sonnets. It's a very woman-centered Midwest and poverty. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Terrence Hayes. Some of you in poetry might recognize his name as being the inventor of the golden shovel, which is a poetic form. But his book, American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin, that's the name of his book too. I am going to read this one. The song must be cultural, confessional, clear, but not obvious. It must be full of compassion and crows bowing in a vulture's shadow. The song must have 6 sides to it and a clamor of voltas. The song must turn on the compass of language like a tangle of wire endowed with feeling. The notes must tear and tear. There must be a love for the minute and minute. There must be a record of witness and daydream where the heart is torn or feathered and tarred, where death is undone, time diminished. The song must hold its own storm and drum and shed a noise so lovely it is sung at sunset, weddings, baptisms, and beheadings henceforth. It's a lot of tension in this, a lot of political statement in this as well. This was influenced by Wanda Coleman, who was both a playful and political poet. And also this particular form is an original form by Jericho Brown, who is a poet who he invented this form, the duplex. It can be considered a sonnet. Is 14 lines. There's a lot of line repetition, but and there's a little bit of change within some of the lines that make it very powerful. So check out the duplex. I love to write duplexes. Anyway, this is I was really excited to see that this was included in that book. Craig Santos Perez, Love in a Time of Climate Change. This is recycling Pablo Neruda's sonnet, sonnet 17. So you can tell, you know, usually it would say after Pablo Neruda's sonnet 17. The fact that it says recycling really points to the direction that this goes, that this is an eco poem. And it's also, it's a love poem and a social critique. I love Craig Santos Perez. He is from Guam. I spent some time on Guam doing some master's research, so it was really beautiful to read that. So Natalie Diaz, she is Latinx and Native writer, and this is her interpretation, Indigenous writer, and this chart or these lines, almost like a sentence diagram, each piece represents her experience with sonnet language. You can tell it doesn't necessarily compute in a traditional way. This is her American crown, her American sonnet crown. There's more that's on the other page, but I just wanted to show you what some of the representations look like. This is Nate Marshall. This one's called African American Literature. And you can see the political statement. It uses the sonnet's relationship with formal artifice to explore questions of race, expectation, and authenticity. The whole poem is, most of the sonnet is, I like your poems because they seem so real. And that final 14th line is, for sure, good look, this also a sonnet. So anyway, interesting statement. And Torrin Greathouse, this is the last poem in this book. And the rest of this book are essays talking about how these different poets use these forms. This is Ars Poetica, or sonnet to be written across my chest and read in a mirror, beginning with a line from Kimuku Han. And it is a mirror image sonnet. It is written backwards. Torrin Greathouse, she is a faculty member at my MFA program. She's a trans poet, and she is so original. She has invented several forms, and the fact that this one is in here is not a surprise to me. And I'm going to end with this one. So we started out talking about, so we talked about Thomas Cole, who, he had his own immigration. We can think of some of these things now as diasporas, people coming in larger populations from Europe, et cetera. This is called Diaspora Sonnet, Traveling Between Apartment Rentals. In October, this was in the New York Times Magazine. This is by Oliver de la Paz. Oliver is my mentor this year, and and today's his birthday. So I wanted to, show a little bit about, if you think about using a sonnet to talk about being in a place that is not familiar or comfortable to you, you can think about maybe this poem. And he's got a book of diaspora sonnets coming out in a few months. So what made the grammar of our early years, moving from place to place, house to flimsy house, was the meaning made between us here and there, and wherever or whenever we moved. The windows chafed. Father pushed boards with his palm to make the concavity recede into dust. The blight in the siding spoke loudly. In its shape, it said, "Here is my body." It said, "Here the rain moves across the rippled wood like a horse through the plains." My father's words, shaky foundations. Shelter was a noun in sentences racing past my ears. The verb was family. The object swept and scrubbed, leaving no trace. So that's the end of what I have to share. And like I said, it is in the chat if you're interested in going back and looking at some of those. Oops. Don't want to do that. If you want to look at some of those interesting forms. So anyway, the sonnet, use it to your advantage. You can do lots of stuff with it.
Thank you, Dawn.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. We just got a critical mass. I tell you what, this series this year, we just got a critical mass of all kinds of stuff. And my head reels a little bit when I think of how much and how dense and rich everything was that we've experienced so far. And we'll kind of try to, I'm going to look back at my notes, and I'm hoping you'll all come back next week for our final session. We'll kind of do a little recap to try to get just revisit a little bit of what we've all experienced, and maybe unlock some ideas for you to contribute to the Chronicle as we go. I'll talk a little bit about essay writing next week, some ideas, some prompts for that as well. And in the meanwhile, get you some links perhaps that you don't already have, and that sort of thing. Don't feel any pressure, but I might reach out to some of you individually with some suggestions too, for things that we might be able to do in terms of having your voice in the Chronicle. So for this next year, so that would be fun. And it was such a fun, lively conversation tonight too. I know that's that's one of the legs of our forum table, as it were, is that ability to converse and roll around and things. And so I thank you all. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to email anytime, and some of you do, and I'll do the best to get back to you. I am having some email problems as we speak with my outgoing mail server. So I'm gonna try to troubleshoot those in the next day or so. So hopefully, so if you reach out to me and you don't hear from me right away, please know that I'm on it. So anyway, have a wonderful week and hope to see you all again for our final gathering. And thank you again, Paul and Dorothy, so much for your presentation, and Dawn for all your hard work and presenting to us as well. So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful week.